Hi, I'm Natasha Frost, and this is Todd Clear. We're at the ASC meetings in 2013 in Atlanta, and I'm so honored to have the opportunity to interview Todd Clear for the Oral History Project for the ASC. Todd is a preeminent scholar in the area of corrections, community justice, and most recently justice reinvestment. He is the author of 13 books now, over 100 articles, and many other sort of newsletter articles, things like that. He's very, very active in the ASC and the ACJS. He's been involved in both organizations for more than 30 years. He may be the only person to have simultaneously served as president of the ACJS and vice president of the ASC at the same time. He has won numerous awards from both of those organizations, including the Bruce Smith Award from the ACJS, the Block Award from the ASC. He was most recently president of the ASC in 2009. He hails from, well, let me start by saying he got his PhD at the University of Albany in the 1970s, not to date you. He earned a master's en route from the University of Albany as well, and his bachelor's degree is from a small Anderson College, which is a small religious school in Anderson, Indiana. So many people may not know Todd as a country boy, but he hails from the Midwest, and if rumor has it correctly, he may be the only male in his family who is not a member of the ministry. He is secretly a deeply religious man, although most people would not know it. So with that brief introduction, let me introduce Todd Clear and open by asking him how he became a criminologist, and I know this is a particularly interesting history.
Well, so it's funny. I got interested in this field by accident. I was a senior at Anderson College and a social work major, and I had this idea that I was going to be some kind of social worker with dependent children or something like that. But to get a degree at Anderson College, you had to do an internship. And the morning the internships were handed out, I slept in, and when I got to the office, there was only one left at the Indiana State Reformatory. So there was either do that or stay an extra semester. So I took that, and it changed my life. The first day I went in, I had hair, sort of down to the back of my waist, and I was a musician at the time, and I thought I was going to go into the prison, and I had this image that there would be, men with pickaxes in the middle of the yard or something, and I was going to walk in, and I was going to stand at the top of the steps, and I was going to stick my fist in the air, I was going to say, "Power to the people," and they were all going to turn around and say, "Power to the people," and I was sort of going to go in, to applause or something. But what actually happened was I was harassed, I was pinched twice, a lot of cat whistles, long hair in the 1970s was not everybody's idea in those days of the way to be, especially for poor working class people who were in prison. And I left shaking and completely captivated by what was going on there. I couldn't imagine this world. And from that time on, I devoted my life to the field of corrections, working with people who've been convicted of crimes.
Okay. And what were your influences, both personal and sort of professional, from the literature, things you had read as a student, for example?
I think the most important event that happened to me was in my first month of graduate study in Albany, 1971, September. And the Attica, if you call it a revolt, it tells you politics. If you call it a riot, so it's sort of a political statement. Anyway, the Attica revolt happened, and I was taking a class on incarceration, and I had this idea that I was going to learn how to run a really great prison, and I was going to go back into the field, and I was going to run a humane prison where people really got rehabilitated. And the Attica revolt was, in many ways, the most fundamental challenge to that idea you could have. It was violent, it was anti-state. They didn't ask for more treatment programs. They asked for food and rights and stuff like that. And I got involved in some research work on this. And again, I had the long hair and the whole deal. And I was in the New York State Department of Corrections. In those days, they used to get a bomb threat every day or so, and they would have these bomb threats. And one day we were outside waiting for the building to be cleared because the bomb threat had been called in, and one of the old corrections guys said to me, so what are you going to do when you finish grad? Because they hated us, we were studying their foibles, right? But he said, so what are you going to do when you finish graduate school? And I said, I'm going to be a prison warden. I had a beard and long hair, and he looked at me and said, just wait right here. And he went away and he came back with a few guys, and he said, so what are you going to do when you leave graduate school? I said, I'm going to be a prison warden. And they all started laughing. And I was like, oh, maybe this is not my thing. And Attica opened my eyes to what prisons really are. Those people in prison who just professor then. He was a trainer. He didn't have a PhD. He had a master's degree in psychology, and he had a career dedicated toward helping the correction system, managers, administrators be better at their work. And I followed him around, and I mimicked everything he did. It was funny. At parties in graduate school, I would be going to a party. People would say, "You're doing a Vince O'Leary invitation." Tell me. But when I graduated, I went to his office, the president's office at Albany, big old office, and I said, "How can I thank you?" And I thought he was going to say, go and do this or whatever. He said, "You can't thank me. You can't possibly thank me." And I was like, "What?" And he said, "I've done more for you than you can possibly ever do for me. The only thing that you can do is do the same thing I've done for you for someone else."
All right.
And it was like, oh, I get it.
Right.
So, and I feel, I think I told you that same speech, right?
Right.
So, I think that what you have as a professor is some precious thing that's been given to you for free, really, by somebody else, and the only thing you can do is give it away. It's really a powerful
Pay it
idea.
forward,
Right.
which is what you have with me and many other of your mentees as well.
Yeah, those poor suckers.
I know, right? So I find it interesting that Todd immediately went to your experiences in the field, because I think you've always had this real connection to the actual working world of corrections, and whether it be probation, prisons. You're the antithesis of an ivory tower scholar, in every way. So I wondered sort of if you have any biographical connections back to the world of academia. I know you do. So I wondered if you want to talk. You talked a lot about that, but your background, your family background.
So my father had a PhD in sociology. He did his dissertation at Chicago. His dissertation committee, even though he studied churches and social movements really, and the social movement he studied was church, his dissertation committee had Thrasher, McKay, and Sutherland on it.
Right.
And he was trained by some of the greatest. Now they weren't really criminologists in those days. We started seeing them as criminologists retrospectively. They were sociologists.
Right.
And sociology at Chicago was sociology, and because in Chicago, if you were interested in sociologists later became interested in power. But what sociologists in those days were interested in really was the distribution of social benefits and social opportunities and social arrangements. And the best way to understand that was through understanding crime. And so these guys who were sociologists wanted to understand how society worked, and they did it by understanding how people who sort of go like this against to society, where they are, but not psychologically, but in terms of institutionally, socially. And so he was trained by sociologists who were, in fact, we now know, the founding criminologists for our field, and he always had a criminology perspective. And as a college professor, many years later, he started the first criminal justice program, undergraduate criminal justice program in Indiana. If I had been 5 years later in my study, I probably would have been a criminal justice major in college.
Right. And so would you say, and the rest of your family went into the ministry and not into academia, so were you the only child in your family to go the academic route, even though you had a father who studied it?
That's right. Well, my father was an ordained minister also, both my brothers, all my uncles, almost all of my cousins. I tell people that I've been on more prayer lists than almost anybody.
Right,
probably,
right.
Anyway. But and people have not been specific enough in what they've asked for in those prayers, I'm sure. So, and I think because religion was such an important part of my life growing up, and my family's conversation, that deeply held beliefs about the way things ought to be, and about right and wrong, and about justice, are really the most powerful themes of the work that I do, I think, and also of the things that I find interesting in our field.
And take a minute to sort of explain your intellectual trajectory. And you've been through a number, I named corrections, I named community justice, now justice reinvestment, but really started out in probation,
Right,
in the early days. So.
And you said this thing about connection to the field. So I never was a probation officer. My father actually retired as a professor and became a probation officer, ironically. And we wrote a couple of things when he was a probation officer, which is good. But I was very proud that if I did training programs for probation officers, they did not know that I'd never been a probation officer, because I was so. I did my doctoral dissertation in a probation agency in New York, and it was over a 3-year period gathering data, and then in Rochester, New York, and then in 5 of the cities around Boston, Middlesex County. And I'm nervous to say it, it's not Woburn, it's Woburn. I learned stuff like that. And I spent so much time in probation agencies, and I was such a sponge, and I was interested in risk. I still am very interested in risk. I think people don't really understand risk, even though it's become parlance. And I really, even though I built this idea that the only justification must be done, then I think you can use prison. And so while the prison system was growing, I was thinking it should be really shrinking. And wrote a book with Vince O'Leary, and we ended up having an argument over this. I don't know, a debate, I guess. He wanted to call it managing the offender in the community, and I wanted to call it controlling the offender in the community, because I believed in this idea of risk control. I still do. And that book was the first in a series of books that sort of marched my thinking. So I thought you can control people in the community, and if you did that, everybody, all these judges and all the politicians would look at that and say, wow, look, probation is just as good as prison, and it's so much cheaper. Let's do it. And so we rebuilt probation as an instrument of controlling people. And I think there's a lot of things from what we did that was really very important. I don't want to cast it all away, but the system kept growing. I mean, it would tell you all these stories. The chief probation in San Francisco, Joan Petersilli did a study of intensive probation in California, and the San Francisco outcomes, I forget what the numbers were, but something like 75% of the probationers in San Francisco ended up back in prison.
Right.
In her study. And he said, this is a success, not a failure. And then I said in a public meeting, so if that's successful, I guess if 100% go back, that's winning the lottery, right? There had to be something wrong in the thinking that was going on in those days, that we were thinking that the purpose of probation is to make sure that guys end up in prison. That is somehow a crowning glory for probation. Well, that has changed. Probation administrators don't talk that much, but in the 80s, there was this enormous commitment to the idea that probation could be just as nasty as sending a person into a box. And we use probation to basically create, some control boxes.
Right. And then you moved into.
Then I wrote Harm in American Penal. I went on sabbatical, so I was burned out. I've been traveling all around the country, working with probation and parole agencies, doing training. I remember we were living in Metuchen, New Jersey at the time, and there was not a single year, I was at Rutgers, and there was not a single year that I was home for everybody's birthday. And I never bought a 5-day train pass, because I never went into the office for 5 days in a week. I was traveling, I'm sure at least 3 weeks out of 4, I was going on at least one trip, sometimes 2. Really, with a group of people, really, not just me, trying to change corrections. Trying to use risk as an idea, but trying to make it as an alternative to imprisonment. Try to make it as a place that people could invest confidence and really grow it up. And I was exhausted. 1990, 91. I went on sabbatical in England and wrote this book, Harm in American Penology. And I go back and I read the introduction to that, and I go like, I got it right there. There's something wrong with this country, that we believe so deeply in the goodness of pain, and it is a cultural flaw in the American psyche. And we have packaged it actually as an idea and exported it to the world. And anyway, so that, and I came back from sabbatical and I said, I can't do this work anymore. I wrote a, this is very funny. Most of my life has just been a series of accidents, you know. And so I wrote this, I was trying to write the next book, and it was messing around with the ideas of, social justice, and I wrote a chapter, and it was sent in to David. It was given to David Karp to review. David Karp was a student of Etzioni's, and I didn't know Karp, and the review I got back was so smart. You know, it was like, I really like this. But
and then you move from there more squarely into the arena of mass incarceration, and
right.
how we solve that problem most recently.
Yeah. So and then I went through a personal crisis with a divorce, and went to Florida State, and in different orders, but anyway, met Dina Rose, and she and I started. I had written a paper. I read this paper. Used to be for years. You Google Todd Clear, you'd get this paper. The boomerang
Backfire.
effect. You know, backfire. How prisons cause crime. And the story of that paper is really interesting. In fact, it's a 2-page footnote. It's a half-page footnote in the new book by a guy who wrote The Tipping Point. He's got a new book called David and Goliath. I forget his name. I think in a second. And so I wrote this paper. I couldn't get it published, but I gave it to some people around, you know, to read it. And some guy who edited the Oklahoma Department of Corrections Research Journal, which must have a distribution of 7. Like, he got this paper, he said, can I publish this in the journal? I said, fine, publish it. And it started making the rounds, because corrections people knew that was true. They knew that prisons, there was a whole conversation going on in criminology, you know, prison, you know, incapacitate people, you prevent all this crime, the nation gets better. I mean, the data didn't bear any of it out, but the point is, criminologists were part and parcel of this great movement going on in the country, that if we just imprison enough of the right people, we can make ourselves safe. And people who ran prisons knew how absurd that was, because they knew what was going on. They knew people were coming in, getting fucked up, and then leaving. And they were coming back. And it was like, they knew this. So this paper went around. And for years, if you Googled me, this was what came up, this paper that was published. She started working on the paper. And at one point, you know, and I was very proud of this paper. And at one point, she was saying, you know, I think my name should go first. I said, no, this is really my paper. She said, well, let's count paragraphs. I said, I feel very strongly that the person who does the most contribution, which is, by the way, this is going to be painful for you to hear, because we have this book together, and my name's first, and you know that I don't have the most. Anyway, we actually counted the paragraphs, and she had written more of them than me.
So she got to go
So she got to go first. It was crushing. And that paper was submitted to criminology, got reviewed and rejected under one editor. And then Bob Bursick became editor, and we did this complete overhaul. Sent it back to Bursick and said, you know, this has been rejected once by criminology, but it's so different. And because it had so much of the work he was interested in,
right.
in it, I said, maybe you would think. And it got the same reviews. The first time I got this review that said, this is stupid. The second review said, this is obvious. And the third review said, I never thought of this before. It got the same 3 reviews.
Right.
But Bursick said, I want to publish it. And that was the beginning. So then in Tallahassee, we did this work on communities, which became the next paper, which was really about, the next book, in Prison and Communities, which was really about how mass incarceration has had such enormously negative collateral consequences for communities,
right.
families, and that was like, I think, the trilogy. The let's control people in the community. Oh my God, what have we done? And then look what we've done.
Right. And so, which of those, your many contributions, are you most proud of? Maybe one of those, or something that you haven't even mentioned yet.
I'm going to surprise you. So when I was dean at Rutgers, you know, I'm just stepped down as dean at Rutgers. In my years at dean at Rutgers, we got a chance to consolidate. There were a handful of institutions in New Jersey who were teaching college courses in prisons. You know, got some money from the Ford Foundation and the Sunshine Lady Foundation, and we offer college courses for every person who's eligible for college, who wants to take a class in the state of New Jersey, who is incarcerated, can take college courses for credit. And if they leave the system, the 8 institutions that are in this consortium, they will all honor every course those students take. Two of our graduates have been Truman Scholars. One of them is studying at the University of Cambridge in criminology right now. A guy who did 4 years in prison in the prison system in New Jersey. I'm more proud of that than anything else I've done.
Than any of your
Than anything else I've done.
contributions.
Yeah, that project is changing lives far beyond any sort of thing you can write on paper. And it's a bunch of dedicated people doing a ton of work. And I think I'm more proud of that than anything else I've done.
Oh, interesting. And also, sort of along those lines, well, along the lines of the work you're most proud of, how has your work endured criticism over the years? And it's faced quite a lot of criticism from...
I was the wacko left. I was on the front page of the website for NRA for years, a criminologist, pro-crime criminologist. And there was my picture. I was very proud of that too. And and there were people who just thought. I'll tell one story about this. I'm obviously telling stories. But people who just thought it is so obvious that if you send bad guys to prison, you remove their crimes. What are these guys thinking? And what I think has happened has been, and I hope our book is right. That the wind is out of those sails, and you don't have criminologists making meaningful arguments anymore. That the growth of the prison system is really a very significant part of the fight against crime. In the 1980s, I can't remember now what year it was. I was in a conference in Phoenix, and Joan Peterseeley and I were speaking as luncheon speakers, and the third guy was the drug czar. I forget his name. And Joan got up and did what Joan does, talking about drug policy and drug policy probation and how probation can be relevant. I had this whole thing. I was going to stand up and do this whole thing on risk, but I was going to go third, and the drug czar got up and he started talking about new drug policies. We're going to test kids in high school, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And I threw my speech away. And there were 150 or 200 people there around tables, after dinner, and the punchline of the story is that that the feds instructed the National Institute of Corrections director at the time to make me apologize.
And you did.
I was called to Washington. I said, look, you're going to ask me to give a speech. I'm going to say what I think. Don't ask me to give a speech if you don't want to hear what I think. And which is the great, the great benefit of being a professor is that you are obligated to say what you think, right, even if you're wrong, and you often are. But there was a time in which that kind of talk was just heresy. It is now mainstream,
right? And
that is, I think, just the sea change that we are in the beginning days.
And even in academia, in the field of ASC here, you have sometimes stirred some emotions among colleagues. Yeah. And I think specifically about your 2009 presidential address, where you came out in some ways against the move toward evidence-based research. And I wonder if you want to comment on your thoughts around the direction of the field. So
I'm glad to actually say something about it, because I love the evidence guys and some very good friends and very close colleagues in that business and people whose work I respect enormously. I think I said that in the speech. If I didn't, I should have. Yeah. But there's a problem, with the evidence-based movement, and it is that that we have no evidence about things we haven't thought of yet. Now, I know Larry Sherman has an idea about how you deal with that, and I think he's a wise guy, so he has some ways to think about it. But I think the problem is that institutionally, when the government says you must be evidence-based, it restricts the whole field of innovation. And we are so far from getting it right. Every idea that I thought was interesting has almost no evidence base.
Right.
And so what I saw was this evidence base, which I thought was filling a void, and I really liked, was also ironically slicing off all my best ideas and saying, you're a wacko. And I suppose in a way I am a wacko, but I wanted to make the point that if we really think that we need something really new, and I truly believe we need something in corrections, then evidence is not going to get us there.
Right. So maybe from that, if you had any advice for young scholars beginning their career or beginning to think about how the shape their careers might take, what advice would you?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that question. That's a good question. I think it's very hard to be a scholar now. How much harder it was when I started. The expectations are higher. The differences in journals are taken more seriously. You got these people like me being deans and provosts and expecting stuff. So I think it's harder, and you can't actually ignore that if you want a good career. That said, there's nothing better than getting into the field. I like the database people who pull a database and look at correlations and stuff. They're really smart. Many of them are very smart. They do things that are useful. Since I'm not good at that, I actually also a little jealous. But you walk into a place where corrections is being done, and it's different than it's different than a questionnaire. It's different than giving out a questionnaire.
Right.
So I would encourage people. So if you want a career, you want to be enthusiastic about what you do, which means I think you want to take risks. Which means I think then you want to really use this thing of tenure, not for the free speech side, but for the idea that that you're able to go down a road not knowing where it's leading. We're really, really conservative in this field of scholarship. Everything about a grant. If you want to get a grant funded, you have to know before you do it that it's going to work. Well, no wonder we get all these really very narrow, boring research funded projects funded, not game changer projects funded, because by the time the review process is done, all of the things that might have taken you down a road you have no idea where it ends up, they've been lopped off. And if you were going to ask a question, you have to be sure you're going to be able to answer that question. There's benefits to that and reasons why we do that, and I get that, but that's so constricting. Almost every really important idea in the field, if you trace it back, comes about from two things going together that nobody expected to put together. Serendipity is a very important principle, but we don't organize the field of inquiry very well to take advantage of serendipity, and we certainly don't in the funding mechanism within the. So if you got the private sector that does funding that already has the answer and wants you to go out and find it, then you got the public sector that is so dependent on being able to actually get an answer that it makes the question so narrow that it becomes uninteresting. And as a consequence, I think innovation is a struggle in our work.
And I know, based on having worked with you on it, that Todd was the founding editor of Criminology and Public Policy. We've done a lot. We haven't talked yet about all your policy work, but I remember as we worked on that journal that you very frequently took a big chance on some of the articles that you would publish, because I distinctly remember as we were working on that you would say, well, if we only publish things that we already know, then we're not going to move this field forward. And in the policy realm, you've got to take some chances. So you have to. So I wondered if you'd speak a little bit about. So we've talked a lot about your practitioner side in a way, about your academic or credential side, and what about the policy world? You do a lot of work in that area, especially more recently.
Yeah, it's funny because I take what you say as right. But I don't think about it that way at all. I don't think that I try to have a policy relevance. I think I'm just built that feels. This is my father.
Mm-hmm.
My father was a socialist. He was kicked out of the country during World War II because he was a pacifist, and he went to be a missionary in Peru. And my mother went down there. They were married. Came back. The feds came into Miami. The feds pulled him away for 3 hours for an interrogation when he came in. He was a lefty in the times when lefties were very suspicious. I remember getting crank calls when I was growing up from people, you nigger lover, we're going to burn a cross in your, we're burn your house down, stuff like that. Growing up in Indiana, and he used to listen to the right-wing radio, and he was to say, because I have to understand what those arguments are if I'm going to deal with them.
And that's what you do now. I remember recently you told me you have been.
And because. If you don't, in some kind of funny way, think that they are right, then you haven't heard them. There has to be a way. I call them wackos because it's funny and it's fun, and it's secure and all that stuff. But there's something about that line of argument that I find so distasteful that is right. And if you don't understand the part of it that's right, you're not going to be able to work with the argument at all. And I think that's policy. I think policy is about building things through this mechanism of finding the right pieces here and the right pieces there, and so I think I'm by how I was raised, naturally there. But I don't think of it merely as policy.
Yourself as having a policy orientation.
No.
Although I think others would describe you as being
Probably
very policy oriented. type of scholar. What effect do you think, and I could probably answer this question for you, but what effect do you think you've had on the many people that you've mentored over the years?
I hope the most important effect I've had, and I think I have, is that they have fun.
Right.
That they laugh, that they make jokes, that they don't take themselves seriously, that the craziness that goes on in academia, you know, the kind of personalities that we tend to produce in our field because of tenure, because of inquiry, because of scholarship, because of the way it works. You know, that we sort of understand the weirdness of it, the oddness of it, take it lightly. And I think that's one thing. I hope I've imparted the idea that personal relationships really matter, and that they're more important actually than science, in my opinion. Science will do what it's going to do, and you know, things that we think are true now, we're going to find out 10 years from now we didn't get right, but relationships will endure, and so, you know, I hope I've done something along those lines.
And you've certainly seen a number of your mentees sort of carry out your research agenda, even when you've moved to other places. If you think about David Card, for example, people who you've worked with over the years who've continued, even though you've moved, progressed, continued your sort of former research agendas, if you want to think of it that way. Would you have done anything differently in your career when you look back? You seem pretty in a happy place. But.
I wake up most mornings and go like, how the hell did this happen? I mean, if I had 20 years ago, somebody had said, ask for whatever you want, you know, you're going to have it. I wouldn't have had the courage, or even the foresight to ask for what's been given to me. So, you know, I think it's ironic. I think the regrets are all personal. You know, I mean, I ended up spending a lot of time. I was so the field was so important to me, and being in the field and being of the field, that I spent a lot of time traveling and a lot of time away. And I think that produced a burden on my family. And you know, I love my kids; they love me. You know, I have an ex-wife who we get along fine for people who were once married and are divorced. You know, but if I could, I don't know if I'd do anything differently. But there is a regret there that you end up making a decision to emphasize some things and you can't do this. Dina and I often say, you know, every decision is a decision to give up things that would happen if you went down this road. You really can't know what they are. And I'm a very hungry person. I would like to have every experience in life. I wish I could have tried different roads and for longer. But the truth is, once you do something, then you sort of cut off all these other possibilities. So. Right.
And I think that's one of the things you probably impart on your mentees that you may not be as aware of. That, you know, that they're, because you have, at least in my experience with you, been very family oriented since, you know, I've known you, that those things probably matter. Given some of your mentees, at least the more recent ones, that sense that, you know, keep balance in your life instead of.
Oh man, happy beats any other choice.
Yeah.
So I often say that, you know, if you're going to ask for something and you don't ask for serenity, you're an idiot. If you ask for money, you know, but serenity would mean you don't have money, you still, it doesn't matter, you have serenity. I mean, so the thing you really want in life, I want to make the seminal contribution on X, Y, Z, or serenity. Well, you're an idiot if you don't ask for serenity. Because if you're given serenity, nothing else really matters.
Right.
You know?
You wouldn't be worried about it. Right. And then, what are some of your general thoughts on the state of where we are in the field today?
Wow. So, you know, when I started doing, I was just reflecting because I'm at this meeting now and I'm about to become a provost, and so I don't know how much I'm going to be at ASC meetings or ACJS meetings. You know, I can't imagine not going. But on the other hand, you know, I have to leave this one early because, you know, bosses get on phones and you have things like labor negotiations and all that stuff. So I think that it has surprised me how the field has grown. It's sophisticated. So I used to go to meetings in the 70s and early 80s, and we used to show up at meetings without a room, and then just find somebody and say, "You got a room? Yeah. Can I crash in your room? Sure." You know, and I won't talk about all the misbehavior that went on because there was a lot of it. You know, it was a field that was, you know, like a bunch of cowboys in a funny kind of way. And it's not like that anymore. It's very, you know, it's more serious. this is not a bad thing. It's just a surprise. You know, I mean, the size of what we do. It's good for us actually. You know, criminal justice now is on many campuses. You know, one of the most scholarly operations going on in arts and sciences. You know, and I'm very proud of that. So I guess that's a surprise. I'm surprised that it took us so long to wise up about prisons. You know, we knew in the mid-1980s this was stupid.
Right.
You know, so, Tommy has a great book, smart guy, Tommy. Which is funny because he was the one who wrote the best critique of that, the Justice and Reinvestment piece I wrote from CPP. It still makes me smile. But Tommy, you know, said, you know, that what we did about sentencing, we knew what it was going to do about racial inequities, and we did it anyway. And that's what is really not what we did. I mean, that's bad enough, but we did it knowing that it was going to have these effects. And no reasonable person could have argued otherwise. Right. And I think that we knew that in the 80s. I think that book might have been written in the early 1990s or late 1980s. And look, and still we did it anyway. And that's a surprise to me.
Right. And then sort of kind of come full circle. What questions now, you started your career 40 years ago almost, what questions ought we be trying to answer now?
Guns. So I think, well, I work in Newark, you know, guns really matter there. So I say guns. There's John Farmer, who's the former dean of the law school there, and I've been toying around about an editorial, writing an editorial, tax guns, because you could say the Second Amendment allows you to have any gun you want. It's just that if you want an Uzi, it's going to be $3,000 a year. You know, or you want a cannon. By the way, I looked this up. Cannons are legal. You can own a cannon, for Christ's sake. Just boggles the mind. But so I think guns are an area where I think we really have to get our minds around violence. There is an intergenerational price that does contract, as you and I argued in the book that just came out. I hope we're right. Then what's going to happen to all these criminal justice programs? It's a really interesting idea. You know, and I think that's going to be a real challenge for us as a field, becoming relevant to not just through growth, but through some other mechanism. And I hope we can rise to the challenge.
And we're actually, just sort of to try to wrap up, we're doing this interview at a moment where you are about to become provost at Rutgers Newark campus. And you're really kind of moving out of academia now. What do you see for the sort of the future, your next five years? Will we never see Todd Clear?
No. You know, I care so much about the social justice aspects of corrections. I can't imagine completely severing those ties. I mean, in my work as a provost, I've already brought in the project that I talked about for college education for people who are incarcerated. That project is now moving from the School of Criminal Justice into my provost's office. The Police Institute that does public safety work in our area is moving from the School of Criminal Justice into the provost's office, because those things need to be shepherded, and they need some careful hands. So I'm going to stay close to those issues. I think that treating people who've been to the criminal justice system as college students rather than felons is the most revolutionary ideal in the world that I've bumped into. It's hard for people to fathom, and we've got people at Rutgers who are doing that. And I think if I can help support that movement through, from a provost point of view, that long after I retire, there'll be fruits in that work.
And my final question would be: is there anything I haven't asked you that you wish I had in the course of this?
You didn't ask me to do the Rutgers cheer,
No.
which is, are you rah-rah, are you rah-rah, hoorah, hoorah, Rutgers rah, upstream red team, upstream rah, Rutgers rah. And you wouldn't ask.
I wouldn't. You'd have to get up and do it properly.
That's true.
So, Thank you so much
Oh, it's
for
great talking to
joining
you.
me for this interview.
Thank
It was
you.
a lot of fun, as I know. Thanks.